Hello, my name is Kaitlyn, and I'm from Sammamish High School, and I'm a part of GZ Radio. This is Earth Focus, a collaboration podcast between Sammamish High School's EnAct and GZ Radio. This is a three-part discussion podcast series covering a few environmental topics. This week, we'll be covering climate change and ocean acidification. There's a lot we'll be covering on this episode, varying from pH levels and what part they play, to how it relates to sea life and how it can affect developing countries and biodiversity. As students, we may not know some things regarding climate, so guests feel free to correct us if needed. So with that, today I have with me.
Hi there, I'm Benjamin Mousseau, and I'm a senior at Interlake High School, and I'm part of Interlake's Green Team.
Hi, I'm Sophia Mckinstry. I'm a student at Sammamish High School, and I'm currently in the AP Environmental Science class.
Okay. Oh yeah, and guess also introduce yourself.
Okay, great. So my name is Hilary Palevsky, and I am a climate scientist and an oceanographer, and I study how the ocean takes up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And my position is as a professor in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Boston College. And thanks so much for having me, and it's really a pleasure to get to chat with all of you.
Yeah, thank you for coming. And so today's topic, we'll be talking about climate change and ocean acidification.
So what is climate change? Climate change refers to the changes in global or regional climate patterns attributed to the increased levels in atmospheric carbon dioxide, which are produced by fossil fuels. And so normally when the sun's rays hit the earth, some of the heat is absorbed and some is reflected. And the heat is absorbed with greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, ozone, and water vapor. And with human activities, we're causing those greenhouse gases to absorb more heat while decreasing the Earth's albedo, which melts things like ice, and this in turn causes global warming and climate change. And climate change is an exceedingly real issue, and it affects humans, plants, and animals in really drastic ways.
Yeah, and so a lot of you probably by now, hopefully, have heard about climate change, but there's kind of another related issue that maybe fewer of you have heard about, which is ocean acidification. It's really related to climate change, though, because similarly to climate change, it's caused by too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so what happens is the ocean just takes up some carbon dioxide, and then that makes it more acidic. And this has all sorts of harmful effects that I'm sure we're going to talk about today.
Okay, so the question I will be asking is, what does climate change relate to public health? How does climate change relate to public health?
Do you want me to jump in and answer that question now, or do we want to hold on a second, recognizing that we have another person jumping on the call?
Welcome.
Hi, sorry I'm late.
No worries at all.
Hi, oh, you're fine.
Hello.
So we just started off
Hi,
with some background about climate change and ocean acidification, but if you want to just introduce yourself real quick, then we can hop into some of the guiding questions here.
Okay, great. Yeah, hi. I'm Jennifer Ewing. I'm with the City of Bellevue. I'm the Environmental Stewardship Program Manager there. And I'm right now leading the update of the city's environmental stewardship plan. And yeah, thank you for having me, and I apologize for running late.
oh, you're fine. Thank you so much for showing up. So our question that was asked right before you started to jump in was, how does climate change relate to public health? And feel free to answer the question anytime you want.
Yeah, Jennifer, do you want to start with this one, or do you want me to jump in?
Either way, if you want to go first, and then I can maybe kind of build off of your answer.
Sure, great. Well, my area of research definitely focuses more broadly on the impacts of the carbon cycle on the ocean, but broadly as a climate scientist, I really think of the reason that I want to study climate change and the reason that I study ocean acidification being that I care about the impacts of these changes on human health and human well-being. And so when we think broadly about public health, which I think is on a lot of people's minds because we're in the midst of a global pandemic and a global public health crisis, we can recognize that there are all these factors that can influence people's health and well-being. So things like living in a floodplain where you're more likely to have floods that are going to force you to be evicted from your home or have to evacuate, living in places that are experiencing heat waves that are becoming more frequent and more intense, all have negative effects on human health and well-being. And so often it's not something as directly cause and effect where we can say that climate change is the one thing that's having a dominant effect on people's health. But in the same way, we're talking about all of these underlying risk factors that affect people's susceptibility to COVID-19. We can think about climate change as increasing everyone's susceptibility to all kinds of negative impacts. And also, I think an important thing to recognize here as we start talking about effects on people is that also, just like COVID-19, climate change doesn't equally affect everyone globally. There are also disproportionate effects on communities of color, in particular in the US, on people who live in the global South and in less developed countries. And so those are also important things for us to keep in mind as we start talking about the effects of climate change on people.
Great. Yeah. I think I would just kind of build on that to say, I think there's some negative impacts of climate change that we've heard a lot about, in particular in our area as we look to start, to have more high heat days. We're looking out, 20, 30 years from now, we could have more like 20, 30 days a year that are over 90 degrees, that creates public health risks, in particular for our more vulnerable populations. We've already started to experience some poor air quality days. In general, we have pretty good air in the region, but we've started to see the impacts of forest fires, which are obviously, perpetuated through climate change and the impact that can have, even if the fires are happening more in Eastern Washington or BC, that can still have an impact on us here in Western Washington. So those are a couple of the kind of bigger impacts that, we're at least starting to feel here in the Northwest. But then on the flip side, I think, when we look at some of the strategies for mitigating the impacts of climate change, a number of those can also have a really positive impact on our health. So looking at increasing tree canopy throughout the city, my focus is more kind of on looking at climate change at the city level, but a lot of this I think can apply to the the state or the region or the country. But as we look at strategies to increase tree canopy, in particular in neighborhoods with lower tree canopy, which happens to be some of our lower income, more underserved neighborhoods, that can help to benefit us through cleaner air, having better access to the natural environment actually helps improve academic outcomes, helps to enhance the walkability of a community. So just being able to go out and go for a walk is good for our public health. And then a lot of the types of development that we're really looking at in Bellevue and in the region is really promoting more transit-oriented development and more walkable, compact communities, which also really leads to a healthier lifestyle where people are able to walk to transit or to do their errands, and that sort of thing also promotes a healthier lifestyle. But a big part of that is also making sure that we have a mix of housing types and affordable housing, so that how we develop and grow as a city, the benefits of that accrue to kind of everyone in the community, not just the people who can afford to live in those areas. But a number of those things, those strategies for managing our growth also, can have positive impacts on reducing, the number of or percent of people who have to drive to work and have a long commute to work. and sit in traffic and things like that.
That's really interesting. I mean, a lot of time, like when I think about, or when I hear, I guess, about like mitigation, like policies that people can take, a lot of the time it's like, it feels like there's some sort of trade-off involved. Like, yeah, we could take action for climate change, but it would be really expensive, or but it might hurt this other aspects of society. But it's nice to hear that you brought up that there's so many things we can take that would actually help combat climate change, and would be good for public health. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I think in Bellevue, the city has a lot of goals around, being a livable community. And so I think we're really trying to reinforce a lot of our work around climate and sustainability is helping us to, achieve those bigger picture goals around being a livable community. But I think you're right that there is a perception of there being trade-offs, but I think we really want to look at how we can identify, a lot of those synergies and reinforce things, that these are smart investments for the long term, and we're helping to grow green jobs and that sort of thing.
All right, I'm gonna go off with the second question. I'm hoping this kind of like mends together the first one. How do you think climate change affects us? I know we like kind of talked a little bit about it, like health and certain like developing countries and other communities that cannot really like support themselves because of the effects of climate change. But like, what are other ways that climate change can affect us?
Do you want to
Yeah,
start
so
with that
I
one?
think, yeah, right. So as you said, right, this is something we touched on a little bit. And I think one of the things that I think can often be a challenge in communicating about climate change is finding those really personal effects on people. And so I think it's important both for us to talk about these global effects, and I think for people particularly in the US, because we contribute so much to emissions, to recognize that other people are being harmed because of our effects. It might be hurting other people more than it's hurting us personally, but it's often also really helpful for people to understand the way it's going to affect them personally and their own lives, and how wherever you live and whatever your life is, that you're going to experience some downsides because of climate change. And so that's, I think, where it's really important to have work like what Jennifer was describing, where you have someone who's really local, who can say, here are what the effects are going to be in the specific place that you live, in your specific community. So I lived in Seattle for a long time when I was a graduate student, but then moved across the country, and now I live in Boston. And so the effects that we expect to see in Boston are a little bit different from the effects in Seattle. So for instance, because of the shape of the coastline here in the East Coast, we're much more susceptible to flooding and storm surge and hurricanes, which are something that I heard people talking about less during the time I was living in Seattle. And so when I talk with people in Boston about those specific effects and how it might affect your life, that narrative has changed a little bit, because now I live in a different place, and the ways that it's affecting people here in particular are a little bit different from the ways they're affecting people in Bellevue or in the rest of Western Washington. And so I think some of those broader things we were talking about, like heat waves and storms and the air pollution that comes from wildfires, are things that are affecting a lot of people in different places. But I think it's important for each individual person, wherever they are, to kind of look into, well, what are the specific effects for me and my community and where I live? And similarly, if you have friends or family who you're talking with about climate change who live somewhere else, it can be helpful to do some research on, well, where that person lives and what might be most effective in their community, to connect with people's own lived experiences and also their values. What do they care about? What are the things that you like to do? You know, if someone has children, talking about the way it's going to affect their children, and making that really personal connection can be really important in understanding those effects of climate change.
Yeah, no, you're right. We don't talk too much about getting hurricanes out here in Washington, so I can see how that might be much more of a talking point in Boston, though. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's absolutely right, that climate change will affect us in different ways in different parts of the country and in different parts of the world. And it will affect, our frontline communities the most. So I think that's kind of another lens, is really who is going to be affected and impacted by climate the most. So I think one of the challenges is that for a lot of people, climate change is kind of just this big problem that's a little hard to digest, that there is, I heard someone talking about it, there's never going to be a vaccine for climate change. Hopefully we'll have a vaccine for the coronavirus at some point, but there's no vaccine for climate, and there's a number of things we have to do. There's kind of no silver bullet. So I think in terms of how it affects us, I think it can be really kind of overwhelming for a lot of people. And Ben, you may have been on the webinar, I don't remember, in Sophia and Kaitlyn, you were, but we had a webinar with a month or so ago with a professor from UW-Bothell, Dr. Jennifer Atkinson, and her answer to this question I thought was really different, and it was really more, how does climate affect us more sort of emotionally? And so, in addition to kind of like the physical and economic impacts that we will feel from climate change, her research is around kind of how climate anxiety and how climate change is impacting us, and how, she's had a lot of students who wanted to major in, environmental studies related to climate change, and then were just sort of too overwhelmed and depressed and decided to switch their majors. And it's kind of like a whole new field of research. So I think I found that to be kind of another aspect of climate change that people don't really talk about much, but I think that's sort of an important thing to recognize, what, a sort of complicated long-term challenge it is. But then on the flip side, what are some things we can start to do individually and more collectively to take action, and to feel like to actually do something, but to really feel like we're doing something. And, so that could be something kind of more minor, like recycling. It could be, making personal choices about your diet to transition to more of a plant-based diet, or making choices around your commute to work. So I think, how it can affect us in terms of what actions we may want to take, or maybe, are struggling to take. I think there's just kind of like a whole range of different types of impacts.
Okay, cool. So another question that kind of also mends with the last one I talked about is, how could climate change affect the ecosystem and animals?
Do you want to start?
I can try to. Hilary, you probably have more sort of a scientific expertise in this area than I do. But I think, at least in our region, we're certainly, seeing, because of climate and pollution and development, our orcas, whales, is kind of like the signature animal of the Northwest, starting to disappear. I think as, the climate changes and our ecosystems change, we may see, kind of other specific examples. This is kind of less my sort of area of expertise, but I think at least in the Northwest, the orcas, I think, are just so top of mind. Orcas and salmon are so top of mind for a lot of people. I think having those two examples that a lot of policies and conversations are oriented around has been helpful. Hilary, you probably know a lot more about this than I do. So I'll just stop there.
Well, certainly my thinking definitely as an oceanographer goes to marine life. And I'm definitely the kind of oceanographer where I think about the chemistry and the single-celled organisms, which are much less the charismatic organisms that gain a lot of public attention, like salmon and orcas. But as a chemist, I think a lot about ocean acidification, which you introduced at the beginning. And so one of the things about ocean acidification is that it makes it harder for marine organisms that build hard parts of their bodies out of calcium carbonate. So that includes things like some of those single-celled organisms, but also things like crabs, oysters, other kinds of shellfish that are also really economically important, culturally important, especially to indigenous folks in the Pacific Northwest, are also being directly affected by ocean acidification. And one of the things that I think is important to point out about the way climate change affects marine life, which is actually somewhat parallel to the way it affects humans as well, is that it's multiple different impacts compounding on each other. So in the ocean, we talk about how ocean acidification is happening at the same time that the ecosystem is warming, and also that the effects of climate change also can lead to deoxygenation, or something called hypoxia. And so organisms aren't just experiencing each one of those things in isolation. They're being affected by a warmer environment, by ocean acidification, and by having less oxygen to be able to breathe, all happening at the same time. And so those effects can be really complex. They can be really hard to study in the lab to know exactly how they're going to play out. And especially for some of these charismatic organisms like salmon and orcas, they're affected by all the other organisms as well. So we're thinking actually about how whole ecosystems are affected together, not just thinking about each organism individually. And so we're starting to empirically go out and see some of these effects in the environment. So off the coast of the Pacific Northwest, people have actually seen some of the zooplankton called pteropods that are really beautiful. So people like to show videos of them, and they're also important food for salmon. People have actually seen that they're starting to see effects of dissolution from ocean acidification. So we can directly observe the effects on them. But some of the science that I do is also trying to think about how we can make projections forward into the future. And I'm sure you've seen some of these reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where we try to understand if we make this choice in terms of policy and emissions, how is that going to play out and what effects is that going to have? And so it's somewhat easier to make those projections for how much warming will there be, how much will the chemistry change, but then actually simulating how is that going to affect all of the different organisms in the ecosystem, and how is that going to play out to affect, say, something like orcas. That's hard for us to be able to make really accurate predictions about. So we have some ideas of what all of those changes are going to be, but we also don't want to wait until we see those changes actually playing out, because once we start to see those negative effects, it's often too late to then be able to take action after they've already started to be observed.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Something that kind of brought up for me, I guess, that I was curious about is, so we talk about like how climate change is going to hurt, like, pteropods, coral reefs, like you all said, orcas and salmon, all that. But I guess for a lot of people, I guess, or some people at least that I've heard, they might not care that much, I guess, about like these pteropods or salmon or whatnot. So I guess one question that I had was kind of just centered around like biodiversity in general, and how, even though it's not affecting us humans directly, why should we care about biodiversity and how climate change is affecting biodiversity?
Yeah, so I think these are the places where, especially when you have a human-centered approach, it's helpful to think about what are the services, whether they're economic or cultural, that the environment provides for people. And so ocean acidification has really gained a lot more attention in the Pacific Northwest than it did initially in other parts of the country, because shellfish farmers were saying this is affecting our livelihoods, this is affecting our family businesses. Native peoples who have important spiritual and cultural practices related to being able to gather and eat shellfish were saying this is really important to us. It's not some isolated effect on an animal that we don't have any interactions with. This affects our ability to feed our families, our ability to practice our cultures. And so I think those are often the effects that gain the most attention. There are a number of different ways that we can talk about ways that different kinds of organisms and ecosystems are important. And so something I've definitely seen people talking about as we're talking about trying to find cures and vaccines for COVID-19 has been thinking about the fact that biodiversity has the potential to help people discover new medicines, to help people better understand things like viruses. There are all kinds of really amazing and exciting viruses that live in the ocean. And we don't know how things like climate change and ocean acidification might be affecting those, because that's not something that has been well enough studied. But that's something where we can say, well, let's hold on. We don't want to hurt the biodiversity that we have in the ocean, or that people talk about that we have in land ecosystems as well, because they might have direct benefits for humans. And so I think those are often the places where, even if you don't have some intrinsic value that you place on biodiversity for its own right, it provides a lot of direct benefits for humans and for society.
Yeah, I think that was great. I don't know that I have much more to add on that one.
Nice. So I'm just gonna try and also bring in some people. Sophia, do you want to add any thoughts on this, or should I just ask next question? And then
Well,
you can
one question I had, it's not necessarily related to what we've been talking about, but kind of bringing it back to the coronavirus and stuff like that. I've been reading in the news that during this global pandemic would be a really good time to sort of tackle the issue of climate change. And so I was just wondering why would it be beneficial or important for us to tackle this issue during this pandemic?
Do you want to start with this one, Jen?
Sure, yeah, I can start with this one. Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think it's certainly highlighting just kind of how, if we need to make shifts in how we function as a society, we can. I think we've seen that there was a study done that, at sort of the peak of the lockdown around the world, that global emissions fell by 17%. Which is significant, but it's also kind of not that significant. So it kind of underscores that with, sort of minimal economic activity, we're still kind of pumping out, about 80% of our normal emissions because they're just locked in systemically. So I think as we start to, move more into the recovery and rebuilding phase, I think that's really the time to think about, okay, how as we are rebooting our economy, and we will have kind of more waves of stimulus and investments and things like that, how do we use this as a time to reflect on how we are growing and investing, and how can we do that more sustainably? I think for our work, we're starting to look at okay, how is this affecting just how we work, as we look at our greenhouse gas emissions for Bellevue, but, for most of the country, I think transportation is about half of our emissions. And so a lot of the drop in emissions has come, more from people working from home. And, I think we're starting to see, okay, maybe we can't, there's always been talk of, remote work kind of being the solution to a lot of our problems, but we've never fully made that transition. But I think now there's much more kind of openness to more flexibility and kind of where and how people work. So I think there's a number of things like that I think we've recognized, can have a lot of great benefits in terms of productivity, reducing traffic, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and that they are possible. But then on the other hand, there's a number of kind of major changes we need to make, to our energy use and that sort of thing, that they're not behavior changes, they're really systemic changes and investments and transitions that need to happen.
Yeah, and those are all really great points. And just to kind of build on and echo what you were saying, Jennifer, right? When we think about the effect of carbon emissions on climate, we're thinking about cumulative carbon emissions over many, many years. So even though there's been this like proportionally more significant than we've done at any other time, though still not as big as we need it to be long-term, drop in emissions over this short period while people have been staying at home, that's not going to make a significant long-term impact on climate change. But it has demonstrated, I think, a number of things that we now have data to back up, including the really important point that all of those actions that people talk about that we can take individually by reducing how much we go out and how much we drive, they're a piece of that pie, but they're really a relatively small piece of that. So we can't solve this problem just through individual action. It really requires systemic change. Right now, we've kind of done that thought experiment. What if no one drove their car anywhere and we all stayed home, which seemed like a totally implausible hypothetical? Well, now we've done it. And we've seen what the effects are going to be. And though they were significant, they weren't as big as we need them to be. But I do agree that it's a really, I guess, moment full of potential where because of the unemployment, because we're recognizing that we're going to need to provide a lot of stimulus for the economy, we have the opportunity to think about putting that stimulus into green jobs and into reshaping the way our energy sector works, right? Not to endorse a specific policy, but there had been a lot of talk about a Green New Deal. And I think coming back to the idea, right, the New Deal came out of needing to come out of the Great Depression. And so recognizing that we now have unemployment that can be most closely compared to what happened in the Great Depression, I think there's a renewed effort to think about what are we going to do to solve the economic problems that we're facing, and is there a way that we compare that with also having already recognized that there are things that we need to do to reshape our energy system and change the way our carbon emissions work in this country.
Yeah, that kind of reminded me of like the Civilian Conservation Corps, right, that they did in the New Deal to help conservation all while helping the economy too. But recognizing we just have like a few minutes left, I guess our final question before we all go is, I know a lot of this talk about climate change and like impending global disasters can be kind of a downer sometimes. So what's kind of something that brings you hope as far as taking action for climate change and making us feel like we can get past these times?
Yeah, so I'll say that this is a question that people always want to ask. And we talked a little bit off the recording earlier about how people often feel the weight of a lot of anxiety and hopelessness when facing the climate crisis. And I think those feelings are really valid. And the desire to have something that makes you feel more positive and hopeful is a totally kind of normal and natural human reaction. But when I think about the answer to that question, I think about some of my favorite climate writers who have talked about this, including Kate Marvel and Mary Annaïse Heglar. And both of them have really questioned this idea of talking about what brings us hope. Kate Marvel has a piece I really like titled, "We Need Courage, Not Hope, to Face Climate Change." And Mary Heglar has done some really great writing pointing out that hope can sometimes prevent us from actually taking action, and that the thing that we need to do is to take action. And she's made some really great analogies to the civil rights movement, saying that sometimes you're facing something that's such a difficult crisis and such a seemingly intractable problem that the correct response isn't just to be hopeful, to say, I think it's all going to get better, but to think, what am I going to do to be able to move the needle on this? And as we've talked about it a little bit, that can involve individual, but also really pushing for systemic change. And so I think what I see us needing in this moment is to do that emotional work to recognize why we can feel so hopeless, but then to recognize that we do have courage, we do have the ability to find ways to make a difference, and to use that to motivate action, and motivate action that is trying to give us reasons that we can be hopeful in the future. And so I really appreciate the work that all of you are doing to raise awareness of this issue, to kind of build your own capacity to take that action. And I think that's what we really need going forward.
Yeah, I think that was great, and I totally agree. And I would just say, you know, one of the things that really gives me hope is working with youth and with students, and that's been, you know, just a great part of my job, and the work I've been doing over the past year has been having students like you coming to city council, you know, sharing your thoughts, participating in public processes, and just really demonstrating, you know, great knowledge and understanding and concern around climate change. In addition to that, really a strong desire to do something. And I think that's really great. And I really just enjoy kind of that opportunity of engaging with students and hearing what you all are thinking about. And you know, it gives me a lot of hope to see kind of our youth really understanding the magnitude of these issues and having a desire to do something about it.
Thank you so much for that. So we're going to be closing out the conversation. I think, Benjamin, that was a nice save with and like asking uplifting questions, so you can just end it on a good note. So thank you guys so much for joining us today on this podcast. Do you guys have any like social media outlets that people could follow you on, or websites people like keep contact with you, so then like when they see this podcast they can use them, and if they want to talk with you guys about some stuff?
For me, you could probably just put the bellevue.gov/environment webpage. I guess we don't really have our own social media account, but yeah, you could just direct people to that to learn more about what we're doing in the city.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm on Twitter. My Twitter handle is just my name, @Hilary Palevsky. Folks are welcome to tweet at me. I'm enthusiastic, if mediocre, social media user. And I'm also really Googleable, so I can definitely give you the link to my website, which has my email posted, and folks are welcome to get in touch with me through email as well.
All right, cool. So yeah, so there are other episodes that you guys could watch if you wanted on pollution. That was last week's podcast, and the next episode's going to come up is climate justice. So this has been Earth Focus with GZ Radio and EnAct. Thank you guys for listening, and check in next week for our third episode.